I found out that my wife was cheating and decided to take revenge. But what happened exceeded all my expectations. Her secret date with her lover turned out to be not as simple as I thought. How did she react when she saw me at the location of her secret hotel? It was a real shock. The revenge was something she definitely didn't expect. You won't believe what I did to make her regret everything. Watch till the end to find out the whole truth. Elvis stood in the dimly lit room, clutching his phone. His heart pounded so hard it seemed like even the neighbors could hear it. On the screen was a message that tore his life in half. When your husband falls asleep, come over. I miss you. He slowly shifted his gaze to Ivana. She was sitting on the bed, absorbed in her phone, completely unaware that her husband already knew. She didn't see how her betrayal had crawled out into the open, didn't feel that this moment would be her last peaceful evening in this house. Elvis took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. This wasn't just one man. He had found proof of two more. She had cheated on him 3 times. And the worst part? He knew these men. Honey, how about we go out for dinner tonight? His voice was steady, without a hint of rage. Ivana looked up at him, slightly surprised, but quickly regained her composure. Oh, I thought you were busy with work, she smiled, turned off her phone, and reached for him. I am, but I want to spend the evening with you. He approached her and stroked her hair. Inside, a storm was raging, but on the surface, he was calm. He wasn't even angry anymore. He was just curious to see how far she had gone. All right, I'll take a quick shower and we'll go. She got up and disappeared into the bathroom. Elvis heard the water running. He sat on the edge of the bed and unlocked her phone. He had known her passcode for a long time. And now, if it weren't for his iron self-control, he would have smashed the phone against the wall. 3 chats, 3 different men, and each of them thought he was the only one. He exhaled. He needed to see them face to face. 3 days later, Elvis sat in a bar. In front of him sat 3 men who had no idea they were all connected by the same woman. So, you all know Ivana, Elvis said, crossing his arms. The men exchanged glances. One of them, a tall black guy with short hair, scoffed, Nah, I don't know her. Although, maybe I've heard something. Don't play dumb, Alex, the second man, a redhead with a tattoo on his arm, interrupted. You literally just said you've been seeing her for months. Alex nervously took a sip of his beer. The third man, slightly older than the others, stared at Elvis thoughtfully. You her husband? He asked. Yes, Elvis smiled, though his fists clenched. A long silence followed. Then the redhead burst out laughing. Is this some kind of joke? What if it's not? Elvis raised an eyebrow. Alex lowered his gaze, rubbing the back of his head. Well, damn. So, we were all playing the same game, but no one knew the rules, the older man muttered. If you're her husband, then what now? Alex looked at Elvis. I want her to feel what I feel, Elvis said quietly. And I think you guys wouldn't mind having a little fun too. The redhead narrowed his eyes. You're talking about revenge? Elvis nodded. And how exactly? Alex leaned forward. I have a few ideas, his voice turned cold, and she won't forget a single one of them. Elvis sat in his car outside the house where he and Ivana lived. His heart beat evenly, though his hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He had just received a message. She was about to betray him again. Baby, I have to work late tonight. Don't wait up for me, she wrote. He knew it was a lie. But this time, she had no idea he wouldn't be waiting for her at home. He'd be waiting somewhere else. Ready? He asked quietly, turning to his new friends. Alex, the redhead Trevor, and the older Nick sat in the car with him. They had all been waiting for this moment. More than ready, Nick replied, smirking. She has no idea what kind of night is waiting for her, Trevor chuckled. Elvis let go of the steering wheel and started the engine. Then let's begin. They waited in the parking lot near the restaurant where Ivana had arranged to meet one of her lovers. She was convinced that Elvis was at home and that none of the men knew about each other. She's here, Alex whispered, pointing at a black car pulling up to the entrance. Ivana stepped out, adjusting her hair and smoothing her dress. She looked confident, beautiful, and completely unaware of what was about to happen. And who's that? Trevor muttered. They watched as a tall man in a business suit approached Ivana. He smiled at her, placed a hand on her back, and leaned in for a kiss. Elvis felt a tight knot form in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. Another one? Alex exhaled sharply. Looks like we've got not 3, but 4 players in this little show, Nick smirked. Well, that just makes it better. More surprises for her. Elvis rolled his shoulders. Time to have some fun. The restaurant was cozy, expensive. The perfect place for a secret date. Ivana sat across from her new man, chatting and playfully touching his hand. She felt safe, completely unaware that somewhere in the room, 4 men were watching her every move. And then everything changed. One by one, they started approaching her table. First, Alex. He walked up to Ivana from the side, placed a hand on her shoulder, and leaned in. Hey, beautiful. Who are you with tonight? Ivana turned sharply, her face going pale. Alex, what are you doing here? Before she could say anything else, Trevor stepped up to the table. He caught her gaze, smirked, and said, Wow, I didn't think you'd have another date tonight. Her eyes darted between them, trying to process what was happening. But when Nick stopped beside her, arms crossed over his chest, she was already starting to rise from her seat. Wait, her voice wavered. What are you all doing here? And then Elvis walked up. His expression was calm, but his eyes said otherwise. Slowly, he placed his phone in front of her, displaying all her chats. I think we all need to have a little talk, he said quietly. Ivana froze. She turned to the man she had arrived with, but he was already getting up, giving her a look of pure contempt before saying, I can't believe I wasted my time on you. He turned sharply and walked away, leaving her alone with the 4 men she had tried to deceive. Her face changed, first confusion, then fear, and finally, anger. You all plotted against me? Her voice trembled. Trevor chuckled. You did this to yourself, sweetheart. Alex smirked. So, what do you have to say now? Ivana was trapped. She realized she had lost everything, and that her life would never be the same again. Ivana sat at the table, her hands trembling, her eyes darting between the men she had so carelessly lied to. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. She was trapped, and the weight of that realization hit her harder than any accusation ever could. Oh, now you have nothing to say? Trevor scoffed, crossing his arms. But when you were lying to each of us, you found plenty of words. It's not what you think, Ivana whispered, her voice trembling as she looked at Elvis. Please, let's talk alone. Elvis calmly raised an eyebrow, leaning in closer. Alone? Why? So you can lie to me again? Or maybe try to weasel your way out of this, like you always do. Ivana pressed her lips together, as if realizing that no words could change the situation. Her gaze flickered to Alex, then to Nick, searching for any kind of salvation, but all she found in their eyes was contempt. Do you all think I'm some terrible person? She finally blurted out, licking her dry lips. Well, what do you think of yourself? Nick shook his head. Did you really believe you could keep all of us on a short leash? I never meant to hurt anyone. She started, but Trevor didn't let her finish. You didn't mean to hurt anyone. His voice rose a pitch. You just wanted everything you could get, right? A husband at home for stability, lovers to keep things exciting, and another one to take you to fancy restaurants, Alex added with a sneer. It was all a mistake. She clutched the edge of the table. Elvis slowly leaned in, his voice cold and distant. A mistake? Ivana, a mistake is forgetting your keys at home or mixing up a meeting date. But when you sleep with 4 different men at the same time, that's not a mistake. That's a choice. Her chest rose and fell rapidly with uneven breaths, tears welling up in her eyes. You all came here just to humiliate me, her voice trembled. No, Ivana, Nick shook his head, finishing his drink. We came here to make sure you can never do this again. Elvis turned to the other men. I think we should wrap this up. She's gotten the message. Alex smirked. Oh, I don't think we're done yet. He pulled out his phone, tapped a few buttons, and placed it on the table, screen facing up. Ivana saw it was a video. Her own face on the screen, her voice. She was laughing, flirting. In the video, she called Elvis boring, said Alex was the best of them all, that Trevor gave her things no other man ever could. She talked about each of them behind their backs, lifting one up just to tear the other down. What is this? She recoiled from the phone as if it were a venomous snake. That's your voice, sweetheart, Trevor said, swirling the drink in his glass. That's you, isn't it? Ivana couldn't answer. We decided your lies deserve to be made public, Nick shrugged. You love being the center of attention, don't you? No, you wouldn't. Her eyes filled with panic. Elvis, please. She reached for him, but he simply stepped back. I'm not your savior anymore, Ivana. Alex pressed a button on his phone. That video is now in the hands of all your friends, your coworkers, even your mother. Ivana gasped, her hands shaking as she grabbed her phone. Notifications flooded the screen. People were asking what was going on. Some said they didn't want anything to do with her anymore. Her world was beginning to collapse. No, please no. Trevor stood up, pulling his keys from his pocket. That's what happens when you play with fire. Alex smirked and nodded. Now clean up this mess yourself. One by one, they turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving her alone, lost among the people who were already whispering about her. Ivana sat at the table, gripping her phone so tightly her fingers turned white. The messages kept coming. Friends, acquaintances, even colleagues were asking what the video meant. Her world was crumbling before her eyes, and the worst part was, there was nothing she could do. She looked toward the restaurant doors, where the 4 men had just disappeared. The men who now hated her more than anyone in the world. No, she whispered, frantically opening her chat with Elvis. She started typing, please, give me a chance to explain. It's not what you think. I love you. But before she could press send, the status of the message changed to, user has blocked you. Ivana felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. Shit. She tried calling Alex. He didn't pick up. Trevor. No answer. Nick didn't even let the call ring. He simply declined it. People around her started glancing in her direction. She could hear someone whispering her name at a nearby table. It felt like the air in the room was thinning, like everything was closing in on her. She abruptly stood up and rushed out of the restaurant, her high heels clacking loudly against the tiles. She needed to find Elvis. Meanwhile, Elvis sat in a bar, sipping whiskey. Alex and Trevor sat beside him, grinning. Did you see her face? That was a masterpiece, Trevor laughed, tapping his glass against the table. She really thought she'd get away with everything, Alex added, twirling his drink in his hands. How do people lie so easily? Because they think they're smarter than everyone else, Nick said, walking up and taking a seat next to them. Elvis stared silently into his drink. He was supposed to feel relieved. He got his revenge. He made her pay for everything. You good? Alex asked, noticing how quiet he had gotten. Yeah, Elvis nodded, but he wasn't so sure himself. A part of him still couldn't believe this had happened, that the woman he loved had betrayed him so easily. Suddenly, the bar doors swung open. Ivana. Her hair was a mess, her eyes red from crying. She looked nothing like the confident woman who had sat at that restaurant table just an hour ago, playing the role of the perfect seductress. Her gaze swept across the room, and the moment she spotted Elvis, she rushed toward him. We need to talk. Her voice was shaking, but she was trying to hold herself together. We. Elvis looked up at her without moving. I think our we stopped existing the moment you decided that one man wasn't enough for you. It's not like that. You've got it all wrong, she cried. Trevor burst out laughing. Oh, this is rich. So we all just misunderstood. Huh? Just a little miscommunication? I. Ivana bit her lip, then suddenly turned back to Elvis, grabbing his arm. Listen to me. Elvis slowly lifted her fingers off his arm and pushed them aside. You don't exist to me anymore, Ivana. Desperation flickered in her eyes. Elvis, I made a mistake. I didn't mean to. Oh, you meant to. Her lips trembled, and she took a step back. Please, I'll do anything to fix this. Elvis finished his whiskey, set the glass down on the table, and finally stood up, looking her straight in the eyes. Too late. and he turned around, walking away. Ivana stood frozen, as if she had been nailed to the floor. She watched him go, watched him disappear out of the bar, and suddenly, it hit her. This was it. She had lost him. Her legs buckled, and she sank onto a bar stool, covering her face with her hands. Alex smirked and winked at Trevor. So, who wants another round? Ivana sat on the bar stool, her hands trembling, her heart pounding in her chest, and panic swirling in her mind. She had lost control of the situation. She had always been the one who set the rules, but now the rules had changed, and she was left with no chance for a comeback. Well, you look like you've just seen a ghost, Alex smirked, taking a sip from his glass. Or lost something that's never coming back, Trevor added with a wicked grin. Ivana lifted her head sharply. You think I'll just give up? You haven't already? Nick asked, surprised. Lady, you just lost everyone who was ever close to you. And you still think you can change something? Elvis loved me, she whispered, more to herself than to them. Alex leaned on the bar and studied her closely. You used that. His love. Her voice trembled. I thought none of it was serious, that I could keep everything under control. Trevor laughed. Control? You lost the moment you started playing the game. Ivana shut her eyes. She had to do something. She couldn't just lose everything like this. Where does he live? She suddenly asked. Alex raised an eyebrow. Why do you want to know? I need to talk to him. Ivana clenched her fists. I can't just sit here and watch everything fall apart. You think he wants to talk to you? Nick shook his head. He hates you. Hate is still an emotion. Her eyes gleamed. Which means he hasn't let me go yet. Alex shrugged. His address is in your phone book. But you're wasting your time. That's my decision. She stood up abruptly, turned around, and walked out of the bar. Nick watched her leave and smirked. All right, bets? How many minutes will she stand outside his door before she realizes it's over? Trevor laughed. I say 5. Alex shook his head. I give her 10. She's stubborn. Ivana stood in front of Elvis's apartment door, her fingers hovering over the doorbell. She took a deep breath, trying to collect her thoughts. Just talk. Just explain, she muttered under her breath. Finally, she pressed the doorbell. Silence. She pressed it again. Footsteps sounded from inside, followed by a voice. Who is it? She swallowed the lump in her throat. It's me. A long pause followed. Then the door suddenly swung open, and Elvis stood before her. His eyes were cold, devoid of any emotion. What do you want? Elvis, give me a chance to explain. He stared at her silently for a few seconds before smirking slightly. Explain? Explain what? How you played me for a fool. Or how you were having fun with other men while I was at home. It wasn't like that. Oh, really? His voice turned sharp. Then tell me, how was it? She felt like she had no answer. Elvis, You're dead to me, Ivana. His voice was calm, but there was steel in it. She shut her eyes, her hands trembling. Please, leave. Elvis. He took a step back and shut the door right in her face. Ivana stood there, unable to believe that this was truly the end. She stood in front of the closed door, her breathing heavy, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of her chest. She couldn't believe Elvis had just shut the door on her, giving her no chance at all. Her fingers curled into fists, and she knocked sharply. Elvis, please, open up. Silence. I know you're there. I'm not leaving until you listen to me. Still silence. Her eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away. No, she wasn't giving up. She knew she could still fix this. I made a mistake, she said, resting her forehead against the door. But I'm human. I make mistakes too. You know that I loved you. Loved? Elvis's voice came from behind the door, and she flinched. A second later, the door swung open, and he stood before her. But his eyes were cold, devoid of even a trace of the feelings he once had for her. Do you even know what love is? She hesitated. Elvis, love is trust, he cut her off. It's respect. Do you even understand what those words mean? She bit her lip, desperately searching for something to say. I got confused. He smirked sarcastically. Confused? About what? Who to go on a date with on Wednesday and who to see on Friday? Her cheeks flushed with humiliation. I couldn't choose. You never planned to choose, he shot back. You wanted all of us. You wanted to live life on your terms, without thinking about anyone else's feelings. She reached for him again, but he took a step back. Go, Ivana. Just go. Elvis, please. You have no power over me anymore. His voice was calm, but firm. Her lips trembled, tears rolling down her cheeks. I still love you. And I don't. He looked at her in a way that made her feel like her whole world had finally, completely fallen apart. And this time, when he shut the door, she knew it was truly over. Her legs gave out, and she sank to the floor right outside his apartment door. For the first time in a long time, she didn't just feel exposed. She felt utterly destroyed. She had lost a game she once thought she could never lose. And now, she was completely alone. Ivana sat on the floor in front of Elvis's door, her breathing ragged, tears streaming down her face. She had never felt this powerless before. The world she had built so carefully had crumbled, leaving her with nothing. She ran a hand over her face, trying to calm herself, but inside, a storm was raging. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. She quickly pulled it out, hoping it was Elvis. But when she saw the name on the screen, her heart clenched. Alex. She pressed the accept button and lifted the phone to her ear. What do you want? Her voice was raw. Oh, so harsh, Alex replied sarcastically. I thought maybe you'd like a drink? Are you mocking me? Not at all. I'm just watching your downfall, and honestly, it's kind of fascinating. Ivana gritted her teeth. If you called just to finish me off, don't waste your time. Oh, you're not rock bottom yet? Alex chuckled. Strange, because Elvis seems to have buried you completely. Her eyes flashed with anger. What do you want? I heard you're not giving up. I have to admit, I'm a little impressed. His voice was calm, almost amused. But tell me honestly, Ivana, what's your next move? She opened her mouth to answer but suddenly realized. She didn't know. For the first time in her life, she had no backup plan. Alex smiled when he heard her silence. Oh, so this is the first time you don't have a way out? She bit her lip. I haven't decided yet. Well, I think you'll try to find a way to get everything back. You underestimate me. I know you perfectly well, Alex replied. And I know you're not the type to give up without a fight. She said nothing. Want some advice? No. Well, I'm giving it to you anyway, he smirked. Forget about Elvis. He's never going to forgive you. Ivana took a deep breath. So what? Just accept it? Or find a new path, Alex paused. Listen, I know you hate losing, but maybe you just picked the wrong game? Her eyebrow twitched slightly. What do you mean? Just that you've always known how to play. So maybe it's time to change the playing field. She hesitated. What are you suggesting? Alex smiled. Let's meet. Why? I have an interesting idea. Ivana hesitated, but then nodded. Fine. She knew this wasn't the end. If one door had closed, she would find another way. Ivana sat in her car, staring out at the night city. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her thoughts tangled, her heart beating fast and unevenly. She didn't know what to expect from this meeting with Alex, but she had no other choice. She couldn't just accept that her life had fallen apart. She had to find a way out, a way to regain control, to prove to everyone that it wasn't over yet. When she arrived at the meeting place, Alex was already waiting. He was sitting at a table in the dark corner of the bar, lounging comfortably in his chair, twirling a glass of whiskey in his hand. His eyes held something that made her uneasy, not just mockery or indifference, but a hidden intrigue. He studied her closely, as if he already knew what she was going to say and was simply waiting for her next move. She sat across from him, not taking her eyes off him. She didn't like this situation, but she knew Alex was right. She could no longer get Elvis back, couldn't justify herself, couldn't make him change his mind. He had made his decision, and now Ivana was alone, with no plan. Alex spoke calmly, confidently, like someone who had already thought everything through. He laid out his idea. Rather than trying to fix what was already broken, she should find a way to make Elvis regret his decision. He suggested that she change, not to actually become better, but to create the illusion of change. He talked about psychology, about how people could be influenced, how to make them come back even when they were convinced they never would. Ivana listened without interrupting. His words made sense, and though it disgusted her to admit that she had ended up in this situation, she knew that Alex had something that could help her. He wasn't just another man she had deceived. He was smarter than she had given him credit for, and now he saw something in her beyond just a woman who had lost everything. Alex explained that the first step was to disappear completely. No calls, no tears, no attempts to reach out to Elvis. He had to feel her absence, to realize that she was no longer playing by his rules. The second step was to create a new image. She had to appear in places where he wouldn't expect her, be someone who would catch his attention. She had to become the one he couldn't hold on to. Ivana listened carefully, her eyes locked on Alex. She understood that this plan didn't guarantee getting Elvis back, but it gave her something else, control. She wasn't ready to be a victim, didn't want everyone to see her as weak. If she couldn't reclaim her past, she could at least make him regret losing her. In the following weeks, Ivana dedicated herself to completely transforming her life. She cut off all contact with Elvis, deleted all his messages, and stopped following him on social media. She worked on herself, changed her style, her mannerisms, even her social circle. She started showing up in places where he went, but she never approached him, never spoke to him. She just existed nearby, forcing him to notice her. At first, Elvis ignored it, but slowly, something began to shift. He no longer saw the Ivana who had once begged for a second chance. She looked confident, happy, as if she hadn't been affected at all by his decision to leave her. It irritated him more than any of her previous attempts to win him back. One evening, when she was at a restaurant with Alex, Elvis happened to be there. He saw her laugh, saw the way she talked, how her eyes sparkled. He couldn't understand what he was feeling. He wanted to hate her, to be sure of his decision. But something inside him started to waver. When he approached her, Ivana showed no weakness. She smiled at him, greeted him, but there was no dependency in her eyes anymore. She had changed, and he couldn't ignore it. That was the moment he realized that maybe, just maybe, he had made a mistake too. But now everything was different. Now, she was the one who decided whether he was worth her attention. Ivana stood by the window, looking out at the night city. The moon reflected in the puddles, and the cool air was a contrast to the heated thoughts swirling in her mind. She still couldn't believe how quickly her life had changed. Just a few months ago, she had been consumed by one desire: to get Elvis back, to make everything as it was before. But now, with every new step she took, the distance between her and the past only grew wider. All that was left was to gather the pieces of her old life and build a new one. She was ready to move forward. But everything changed that night at the restaurant when Elvis saw her. She couldn't forget the look he gave her when their eyes met for the first time in months. At first, he didn't approach, just stood there, as if searching for familiar traces of the woman he had once loved. She noticed how he tried to appear calm, but a flicker of unease passed through his gaze. Ivana didn't give him the chance to see any weakness. She smiled, greeted him, but there was no longer that helpless longing in her eyes. She was different. She could feel it, and Elvis couldn't deny it. She hadn't expected that moment to change everything. Elvis started asking about her through mutual friends. He found out that she had changed not only her appearance, but also her social circle, her lifestyle. Everyone who had seen her couldn't help but notice how different she had become. Confident, independent, nothing like the Ivana who had once been by his side. It began to eat away at him because he realized that he had lost something valuable, something he had taken for granted. And he only felt it now, when it was too late. Meanwhile, Ivana had completely shifted her strategy. She no longer tried to rebuild what had been broken. She no longer needed his validation. She was living for herself again. With every new step, she felt stronger, more independent. She was no longer the woman waiting for a man to return. She had become a woman who could shape her own destiny. But even after changing her life, the shadow of the past still lingered. Now that she saw how Elvis was beginning to take an interest in her new life, she realized that this was only the first step toward a complete transformation. She wasn't ready to forgive him for betraying her, but she also wasn't seeking to be with him again. She wanted him to feel what it was like to lose her when everything had already been decided. But things took an unexpected turn when Alex reached out to her one day. He called and told her he had important news. That was the moment Ivana realized that Alex had another idea, another plan. And even though she tried to walk away from all of it, something in her heart pushed her toward meeting him. She was ready for another game. But this time, she wouldn't allow herself to be just a pawn in someone else's plan. Alex had been right in his earlier prediction. Elvis was growing more irritated by Ivana's transformation. He tried to win her back, but he didn't understand that this was no longer about simple desire. Ivana had changed, and he couldn't ignore it. He even attempted to manipulate her, but she had grown too strong to fall into his trap again. She saw how he was trying to play with her emotions, but she wouldn't let him pull her back into his web. At that moment, Ivana realized that the true turning point in her life wasn't about rekindling her relationship with Elvis. No, the real transformation was in how she saw everything that had happened. She understood that every attempt to restore her old life had only kept her trapped. And only when she let go of the past, when she stopped living in the shadow of betrayal and pain, was she finally able to live for herself. Now, when Elvis tried to win her back, it no longer mattered. He was no longer the same man he had been before, and she had changed too. She no longer waited for his apology, nor did she crave his attention. But what happened next was a true shock for everyone. It turned out that Alex, who had been so supportive of Ivana and had helped her, was not just a friend. He had his own plans for her all along. It turned out that he had been working with Elvis from the very beginning. His goal wasn't just to observe Ivana's transformation, but to help Elvis get her back, just through very different methods. Ivana discovered the truth when she accidentally found old messages between Alex and Elvis. They had been discussing her transformation, but their conversations had nothing to do with what she had imagined. It turned out that all the changes in her life had been part of their plan, to push her back into their circle, into their games. Now that she knew the truth, she had to make a choice: continue living for herself or fall for their manipulations again. But she had grown too strong to allow that. Ivana sat on the balcony, staring into the night city. The streets were filled with shadows, and only the distant glow of streetlights gave her a sense of warmth. She kept replaying the messages she had found on Alex's phone. How had this happened? She hadn't been prepared for it, but she couldn't turn a blind eye to the truth. She had felt something was off from the very beginning. How Alex was always there. How even his good advice sounded too careful, too focused on changing her perspective. Now she understood that behind it all was a plan, and it wasn't just about her new life. It was part of a bigger game, one she had unknowingly become a player in. She remembered how Alex had told her how important it was to change, how important it was to let go of the past. But he had never explained why she needed to change. Her transformation had only been a piece of a much larger scheme. It became clear when she found his messages with Elvis, where Alex had directly stated that he wanted her to return, but through her own change, so that she would realize on her own why she needed to leave everything behind. It turned out that everything had been planned even before Ivana took her life back into her own hands. She picked up her phone, and Alex's number flashed on the screen again. She had no doubt that he knew she had found out everything. And not just that, he was already planning his next move. But now, Ivana was ready. She wouldn't let herself become a pawn in their game again. She opened the last messages he had sent her just hours earlier. "You've changed, Ivana. Now you know why it was necessary. Are you ready to come back?" She sighed, carefully choosing her words, knowing this was her moment. "I know everything, Alex. And I'm not coming back. You both will pay for what you did to me." After sending the message, she stood up and walked back inside. Her heart was racing, but she couldn't turn back now. This was the moment she had to decide who she truly was. She was no longer the woman who waited for someone to return, nor someone who needed to be saved. She was independent, and this was her chance to prove that she could take control of her own life. A few minutes later, her phone rang. It was Elvis. "Ivana, where are you?" His voice carried a mix of concern and anxiety. "I know you found out about Alex and me." You need to hear me out. Ivana hadn't been expecting this call, but she knew she couldn't avoid it. She sat on the edge of her bed and turned off the phone, unwilling to hear another word from him. All these months, he had been trying to win her back, manipulating her emotions, using their shared memories. But it no longer mattered. She didn't need it anymore. And even now, as he tried to get her attention again, she realized that his words were nothing more than empty promises she was no longer willing to listen to. But suddenly, her phone rang again. This time, it was Alex. She answered. Ivana, you don't understand. I wasn't with him. I wasn't part of this plan. It was my mistake. I didn't know he would take it this far. Alex's voice was so desperate that, for a brief moment, she almost felt her heart soften. But she quickly pushed that feeling aside. She had been prepared for this. What are you trying to say, Alex? You want me to believe you now? Ivana felt her heart clench. She wasn't sure if she should believe him at all. I know things didn't go as planned, but believe me, I genuinely want you to be happy. And I can make that happen. His voice lowered, and silence stretched between them. Ivana remained quiet, feeling how the pain of betrayal and manipulation was slowly beginning to fade. She had decided to uncover the full truth, and if this was her final step, she would take it. So, now you want to be honest? Ivana said slowly. You want me to believe that everything will be different now? Yes, he answered. I promise it will be. But Ivana was no longer willing to go back. She set the phone down and took a deep breath. She knew that there were many people in the world, but only a few were truly honest with you. And all she needed to do was allow herself to let go of the past. True freedom was in her own hands. Ivana stood up and walked to the window. She watched as the first rays of morning light appeared on the horizon. She was no longer the woman who waited for answers. She was ready to move forward, without fear, without regret. This was her path, and she had chosen it. Would you be willing to forgive betrayal if it happened due to deep emotional reasons rather than just personal desires?